In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, one God. Before I jump into my homily, I just want to highlight something that you may notice this morning. During the month of October in our archdiocese, it is committed to Youth Month. And so part of what we do in our parish and all Antiochian parishes during this month is we highlight and emphasize the ministry of youth in our parish and in the world. So that's why the teens and the children who may not sing as much as they do. I know that some of our teens are part of the choir every Sunday. That's why they're doing the music. That's why Greta did our reading this morning. And of course, when we have communion and some of those other things later in the service, the youth will be front and center on that. So that's what's going on with that. Well, for our homily this morning, we have this reading, which is one of three stories that we hear in the church about Jesus Christ raising someone from the dead. We have this particular story about the son of a widow who's raised. We have this story of Jesus going to the synagogue leader's home and raising the daughter who's just died. That's also that one where he goes through the crowd and the woman with the issue of the blood touches the hem of his garment. And then, of course, the one that is the most important one that we hear is the day before Palm Sunday, Lazarus Saturday, where Jesus raises a man who has been dead for 3 days. So those are the miracle stories that we hear. And this particular one, of course, it's in the context of what we would today say as well. It's the funeral has happened, and they're going to the cemetery to have the graveside service. And Jesus Christ interrupts them. And that's something that we're familiar with, not the interruption part. But in terms of, in our lives, we have people that we love who at some point will die. And there are varying circumstances on how someone might die. And there is typically a funeral, and there is typically a graveside service. So, my homily today, hold your hats, is essentially about funerals in the Orthodox Church. Well, Father, why talk about that now? The difficulty of having this conversation when someone has died is it is not the appropriate time to have that conversation. If you've been to a funeral that I preach at, I have the same homily that I preach. And it makes the same point. And I juxtapose two things. I juxtapose that someone that you love has departed, and that you're grieving that loss. And there's an absence, and you have an inability to express love and interact with that person anymore. And that's a reality. And you embrace that. It's a right and good thing to grieve when someone dies. But then I do the other story. And if it's in this church, we have our icon of the resurrection over here. And I go to the Pascha message. And I talk about Christ, risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, his own death. And upon those in the tombs bestowing life. And I will use the phrase, it's not the end of the story. I don't get into depth or detail past that. But I make the basic point. It's okay to grieve, but it's not the end of the story. And as Orthodox Christians, we believe in something bigger than what is happening in that moment. The difficulty of talking about things in that moment is people are steeped in that grief. And they may have the why question. Why did this person die? This is getting more at the kernel of what we'll look at in the homily here. And often we may be inclined to say things that we think are helpful, but are probably platitudes of some sort. They lived a long life. Well, at least their suffering is over. Well, they've gone to a better place. Well, there's some value in that one. But it can get into all of these things where we try and say things to make people feel better, but they can often ring hollow. And there are negative versions of that too. And usually they're ones that have to do with pointing the finger at God. Why did God take my loved one? What's the plan? that God has for my loved one and they're dying. Or that's a platitude. God has a bigger plan for the person that has just died. Well, we can talk some about that. Part of it is in looking at this particular story that we have here. But I think that what we deal with, and I preached this reading a few years back, and the title of it was The Inevitability of Death. Our experience in the world is that everyone we know and we encounter will die at some point. Every funeral that we've attended and graveside service, the person's died, we had the funeral, we went to the graveside, we buried them. And they stayed buried. So our experience of the world is people die and they're gone. And part of what we have difficulty with is we have a hard time saying that that is the end of the story. And we'll get stuck on that. We can transition here. I'm going to insert a PSA here, because this is another opportunity, public service announcement. I don't know if everyone is aware of this, and I have to emphasize it. In the Orthodox Church, when someone dies, we do not cremate the body. I know that sometimes families will have these plans for funerals and memorial services, and often they will call me and say, "Father, this is everything that we want to do." And I say, hold on, there are some things that are problematic about that. Basically, the bishops of our church have told the clergy in the parishes, I cannot be in the presence of cremated remains. And so if you have a family member who gets cremated, I can't do anything. I have to stay out of it. And I know that can sound like a harsh thing. And I'll explain the reason for that. This was a common practice throughout all Christianity, West and East, up until about the mid-century, last century. And then other Christian groups got into this thing where they said it was okay to do cremations. We stood and said, no, we're not doing that. And that's because we have a sacramental worldview. We don't spiritualize and say who we are as people is just the spirit only. It's our bodies. Your body was baptized in a font, and that transformed you and joined you to the body of the church. Every week you come to church and partake of Holy Communion. That goes into your body. The prayers that you say, you do with the body that you have. And kind of the bigger story. We recite this in the Creed. I believe in the resurrection of the dead. We say at the end of history, bodies are resurrected. The souls and the bodies are reunited. Cremation, from the standpoint of the Orthodox Church, is the intentional destruction by man of a body. The body's holy. Think of the last thing that we do in a funeral. It's open casket. Everyone is invited to come up, and the part of the service is called the last kiss. Everyone is invited to come and kiss the departed loved one, like an icon. So, PSA. Don't get cremated. Tell all your family and friends, don't have me cremated. Anyone Orthodox who talks about being cremated, say, Father said, can't do that. Get the word out. Well, as I said, we have this sense of the inevitability of death. That is the experience that we see all around us. And that is really a statement of the fallenness of the world. Part of what we talk about with Adam and Eve falling, and I know I interject this in homilies all the time, it's the introduction of sin, suffering, and death into the world. It's not just us. Look at plants and animals. Everything living dies at some point, and it doesn't come back to life, as it were. That's normal in the sense of what the world is fallen for. But the difference is we were not created for them. Before the fall, and the intention in the creation was that we would live with God perpetually. And of course, the promise at the resurrection of the dead and the last judgment and the new kingdom and the new world and the new eternity is that we will be with God forever. So when we get shocked when someone dies and ask why, part of the answer is, well, that's the state of a fallen world. Everything dies. But part of why we have that shock is we have imprinted on us by God. That's not normal in terms of what He wanted for us. And so it is that reaction. How can this person be dead and gone? They're supposed to be here perpetually. So we get glimpses, and that's what we have in this gospel reading. We get glimpses of what we have awaiting for us in stories like the story of the widow. And it's very poignant about what is happening with this story. We hear that the son has died. We hear that the mother is a widow. And what that means, first century Palestine, is there's no one to take care of the mother. She doesn't have a husband who provides a livelihood. There are no other family members at this point that can provide a livelihood. It's this concern that after they go and bury the son, the mother, the widow, is on her own. And she basically has to beg. And I know there are provisions in Jewish law that there are aspects where the people have to take care of widows. But still, it's going to this point of being concerned day after day. Where is my next meal coming from? Will I have shelter? Not to mention the grief of a mother losing a son after already losing a husband and being alone. So what we hear in Jesus Christ raising the son is something of a restoration for that woman. It's an act of mercy by Jesus Christ for that woman. Because when the son has been raised, she's not alone anymore. She has someone to help her. She has someone to provide a livelihood for her. And the point that Jesus Christ makes, and this is kind of the big theological thing in all of these stories of raising someone from the dead, is He has the power over death. And that does get to that message that we talk about on Pascha. You know, the image that we have, and I point this out all the time, is that the understanding of what happened to people's souls before Jesus is they went to a place called Hades. It's not hell with fire and pitchforks. I liken it to a big waiting room. And so all of the people that we read about in the Old Testament and everyone else up to the time of Jesus Christ were just waiting. Their souls were there. No pleasure, no torment, waiting. The humorous version, when I think about this, is going to the doctor's office, and the doctor's running late about an hour. And of course, there are all the magazines that are about 3 years out of date, and you're just sitting there waiting, wondering what's going on and when you're going to be seen. Now imagine that on a grander scale. So what we have in the icon is Jesus Christ breaking the doors of Hades. So if you look at the bottom, there are the two cross boards. Think of double doors that have been ripped off the hinges and thrown on the ground. And there are little pieces in there in the dark background. There are locks and keys, all broken. And so it's saying, Jesus Christ is saying, there is a path forward. So even though we, in this present time, live in a fallen world, where the normalcy of the fallen world is people die and they're buried, end of story. It goes to this bigger story. And the miracle we hear says that there is more to the story. We don't have to despair that it's the end of the story. There is the promise of eternal life. And there is the promise that the story is not over. And there is the promise that the loved ones that we may miss now because they have died and we've buried them, we will see them again. Now this kind of leads into some of the things about, well, what happens after you die? That sort of question. And we'll have an opportunity to look at that in a few weeks here. In a few weeks, our reading is the story of Lazarus and the rich man. And of course, they both die, and kind of what does that all mean? That parable helps explain that piece. So we'll come to that question in a few weeks. So as I said, what we're looking at here is what we experience when someone dies, and the funeral and the burial. But the promise, and one of the things that we can hang our hat on, is in Jesus Christ's infinite mercy. What we see in the gospel story is the promise that each and every one of us has at His second coming. It's not over until then. And when we reach that point, everyone's with us, including all the people that we miss and love and haven't seen because they've died and been buried. Glory to Jesus Christ.
Glory to